you all for being here today for the discussion of the situation of prisoners of conscience in Russia, Belarus, and Azerbaijan. We have the privilege of bringing together an extraordinary panel, those who have survived political imprisonment and persecution under authoritarian regimes, and those who have worked tirelessly to secure their freedom, defend human rights and justice. I'll introduce our speakers one by one as we move through the discussion. We begin with Mariana Katsarova, the first ever UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in Russia. Her mandate, the first of its kind in UN history, was created in 2022, finally shattering the long-standing illusion that Russia has no human rights problem, an illusion but painfully familiar to those who spent years resisting the tightening grip of autocracy. This recognition by the international community was long overdue, and in Mariana Katsarova, we could not have hoped for a more fearless and capable advocate. Mariana, we are deeply grateful to have you with us today. Thank you. Your latest report in September 2024 reveals that political imprisonment in Russia is no longer an exception, but a central instrument of state repression. Yet, just weeks earlier, something almost unimaginable happened, the largest ever exchange of political prisoners involving not just Russia, but also Belarus and Western countries. Mariana, after all the work exposing the suffering of those imprisoned for their courage to speak the truth, what was it like for you on a personal level to hear that they have been freed? And given the unprecedented nature of this exchange, what does it reveal about the power and the limitation of international advocacy in securing the release of prisoners of conscience?
Yes, good afternoon. Thank you very much for, despite competing events and plenary discussions, you're here with us today. I'm particularly honored to be here, and I returned to Geneva. I was already gone. I was here last week, but returned for this event because I'm honored to be in the company of incredible human rights activists, former political prisoners, who are speaking here for the first time in Geneva. This is Ksenia Fadeyeva, Lilia Chanisheva, two Russian human rights defenders and opposition leaders who were heading Alexei Navalny's organizations in their cities. For that, they were arrested, they were imprisoned, and only because of this prisoner exchange last year, they were freed. They couldn't come at our invitation last September to speak here because the Russian authorities did not give them their passports when they were released. And also I'm very moved and very proud to be sharing this event. It's actually a unique event for which I'm grateful, with my colleague Karina Moskalenko, and I see also Susan, another expert in the audience, from this unique accountability, now independent mandate on investigating the atrocities following the presidential elections in Belarus, and also to hear from Natalia, who is a Belarusian former political prisoner, because I think it's a totally together affair, what we're doing and our calls for accountability for the political repressions in Russia, in Belarus, and in Azerbaijan, because I believe that the repression in Russia is spreading to other countries. Or if they already had their repression against the dissidents and the human rights defenders, now they have free hand, as we see with many other countries in the region, like Georgia, like others, that are getting the vibe. But that's why we need to be together. If repressive governments and authorities are checking the textbooks of how to repress, how to introduce repressive laws in other countries, spreading it in the region, spreading it to the world, we as human rights experts from the UN and civil society have to be together. So you asked me how it made me feel. Honestly, we all cried. And I want to say how grateful I am. I'm glad to see here the member states, United States, Germany, Poland, and I will now miss somebody because it was 8 countries that participated. Norway, was it Netherlands? I don't remember, no. But it was such an effort of member states. Obviously, it wasn't something that me as a special rapporteur had any say in it because this is government undertaking with their security services, but how happy we all were. And honestly, looking at the moment at how things are progressing, we can only hope that a second such exchange is possible. I don't see it, honestly, I don't see it realistically happening anytime soon, for the Russian political prisoners at least. Let's hope for the Belarusian. Let's hope for any, for the Azeri political prisoners. I think it was a unique thing. I think it saved their lives because Navalny's death showed us that, I mean, I have been asking who's next after Navalny in the Russian context. And then, let alone with the continuing aggression against Ukraine, and these things are very connected. And from the first day of my mandate, I have been really securing the understanding of the narrative that the repression at home, the escalation of repression against anti-war critics, dissidents in Russia, human rights defenders, is absolutely related with the aggression against Ukraine. If the Russian authorities did not apply a strategy to silence their civil society, the independent media, the anti-war critics, the peaceful demonstrators, the aggression against Ukraine would not have been possible the way it was possible, I believe. And also vice versa. We see the methods of torture, the systematic and widespread strategy of torture, which is applied equally against the Ukrainian detainees deported to Russia, who are in their thousands. We don't even know the exact number. At the same time, applied against the more than 2,000, we don't exactly know how many, 2 Russian political prisoners, and as you call them, prisoners of conscience. Don't be mistaken, we're talking about the same people, just our colleagues from civil society have taken the Amnesty International qualification. Prisoner of conscience is a person who never advocated or promoted violence or participated in organizations that held arms. For example, Nelson Mandela, and I'm talking now as a former Amnesty International researcher on Russia for 10 years, many years ago. Nelson Mandela was never adopted as prisoner of conscience because ANC, his organization, was promoting end of apartheid through violent means to overthrow the torturous system of apartheid in South Africa. But we're talking here about Russian political prisoners who have not advocated violence, who are mainly for the voicing of anti-war sentiments, for even saying the word war. Because in Russia, it's the authorities, the word war is forbidden. The authorities are promoting the special, since to this day, the special military operation, which is not a war. And therefore, the Ukrainian prisoners of war, again, in their thousands, we don't know how many they are in Russian prisons, are not afforded the status under the Geneva Conventions of prisoners of war. They're not benefiting from the Geneva Conventions. They're held as and tried very often in Russian courts under civilian charges on terrorism, on anything to do with not to do with conduct of hostilities, which prisoners of war should be tried if there is any reason to be tried, but afforded the full protection of the Geneva Conventions. Now, back to the political prisoners, or would you like to ask me questions. I don't know how it will work.
Just maybe the second part of the question, the power and limitation of international advocacy in securing the release.
Well, you know, it's this time in the world that anybody who says we have a solution would be misleading all of us. We can only ask questions, we could call according to international law, according to our belief in human rights, what needs to be done. But the pathway to doing it is very difficult at the moment with the political landscape in the world and at the United Nations. Unprecedentedly, for example, the Russian and Ukrainian civil society movements got together recently and ahead of the anniversary, of the sad anniversary of the beginning of the aggression against Ukraine, they started a campaign which is called People First, together, calling for the release of the Russian political prisoners and the Ukrainian, all Ukrainian detainees in Russian prisons, POWs and civilians. And of course, I have been supporting their campaign as well to amplify their voice, because no lasting and just peace is possible for Ukraine without justice and accountability for, first and foremost, for the Russian political prisoners, their release, and the return of the Ukrainian civilian and POWs back to Ukraine. However, practically, is that possible, right? I have identified, and I have been advocating with member states, there is a list of 120 Russian political prisoners who are in a very serious medical condition, very poor health, due to the torturous conditions of detention. Some of them have been subjected to torture and treatment as well. And including in this group of 120 who are really facing risk on their lives, facing death in Russian prisons. In this group are also at least 40 urgent cases of Crimean Tatars. You're probably aware that since Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014, at least 219 Ukrainians from occupied Crimea have been arbitrarily detained in Russia. And they are currently, including 133 Crimean Tatars, they are considered by Memorial, the human rights organization, which is giving the status, if you want, of political prisoners working on this, and by my mandate as political prisoners in Russia. And when we call for the release of all political prisoners from Russian prisons, we also think of the Ukrainian Crimean Tatars targeted in a strategy by the authorities since the annexation of Crimea. So as I said, at least 40 of them need urgent medical care, which they're being denied in prison. Among them, human rights defenders Tofik Abdul Khajiev and Enver Ametov. Among the thousands of Ukrainian civilians being deported to Russian prisons and staying in Russian prisons incommunicado at the moment, there are at least 20 Ukrainian women who are also in a critical medical condition, and I have been calling with member states to use their good offices in any peace negotiations, or also with the Ukrainian government, who requested this list from me. I gave it to them, for these women to be requested urgently in the POW exchanges that are happening between Ukraine and Russia. You probably know that even 2 days ago, in Russia, one Soviet dissident who actually has been subjected during Soviet times to imprisonment by the Soviet authorities, to forced psychiatric treatment. His name is Alexander Skobov, a 66-year-old prominent Russian human rights defender, historian, dissident. He's now facing really severe repression. On 18 March, prosecutors requested 18 years imprisonment for Skobov, only because he's been charged with justifying terrorism and participation in a terrorist community, only for a post on social media about the Ukrainian attacks on the Crimean Bridge. His arrest in April 2024 marked yet another instance of the Russian authorities targeting individuals who not only criticize the authorities, but criticize the strategy, the foreign policy of aggression of the Russian authorities against Ukraine. Now, Skobov was active in the 1970s, since the 1970s. We also just now received the information about Maria Ponomarenko, a journalist who was writing and condemning on social media the Russian strikes and destruction of the drama theater in Mariupol, if you remember, where hundreds of civilians died who have, Ukrainian civilians from Mariupol who have found refuge in this drama theater. Maria was detained, sentenced in 2023. She was also subjected to forced psychiatric treatment. Now she is placed far away in Siberia, and we just received information that there is an additional, the information about her additional criminal case has been opened against her in November 2023 for allegedly attacking two male penal colony guards. But now we just received information that she has been suicidal, so she's doing attempts on her life. I could continue. I could only remind you again about the Russian poet who wrote a poem against the war against Ukraine. And this Russian poet at detention in his apartment was gang raped by 3 Russian police officers who not only gang raped him, but they videoed and transmitted in real time in the other room where his girlfriend was sitting, again detained by the Russian police. They were transmitting to her how they're raping her boyfriend. And when this poet, and I'm not mentioning his name because he now received 7.5 years imprisonment, and you know what happens with people who are either LGBT or have been raped by the police, doesn't matter, they continue to be raped and re-raped by, with the acquiescence of the prison authorities in Russia. So I try not to highlight his name when I speak publicly. But he spoke in court about to the judge about his torture, and no investigation was open. On the contrary, he received 7.5 years imprisonment. And this is the usual case to Russians, to Ukrainians. Natalia Vlasova, who is a Ukrainian civilian woman who was kept in Donetsk. She was detained on the occupied territories and recently was tried in Russia, in Rostov. She received 18 years and 2 months imprisonment. In court, she spoke about, in a military court, which by chance the Russian authorities opened, so it wasn't a closed trial. Now almost no trials are open in Rostov against the Ukrainian detainees. She spoke how she was gang raped by 15 Russian officers, and how after that they filed down her teeth. A beautiful woman, was that what prompted them to file her teeth down? I don't know, but I haven't heard coming down to such despicable forms of torture. And despite the fear, she's in Russia, she was facing huge charges of terrorism, of anything you name it, and she received the 18 years imprisonment. She spoke bravely about her torture. No investigation was open, and we can bet that there will not be any investigation. So I think even since my report to the Human Rights Council in September, and since my first thematic report in October at the General Assembly, which repressions in Russia against political prisoners, against the Ukrainian detainees, against the Crimean Tatars who are political prisoners in Russia has intensified. And Mr. Volodin, and I'll finish with that, Mr. Volodin, who is the head of he's the chair of the Russian Duma, of the parliament, I suppose emboldened by the recent closure of US aid by the new American administration, he publicly asked, he said in parliament recently, and we will call on the American government to give us all the lists with the names of the Russian human rights defenders and organizations that have received funding one way or another from the United States, because we want to give them to the FSB, to the security services, to investigate them. They have to pay the price for doing so. Now, I fear every day that this list would be given and that more human rights defenders and activists who are still remaining in Russia, the lawyers who continue to work in Russia and provide defense for political prisoners and the Ukrainian detainees during the trials in Russia, these people will be subjected to a new wave of repression. And the same Mr. Volodin just recently announced that there is a new idea, and this is a new law that Russia is planning, the parliament is planning to pass. That was on 13th of March. So Mr. Volodin said that one proposal introduces criminal responsibility for up to 7 years imprisonment and confiscation of property for assisting international organizations, which Russia is not a member of, which is the International Criminal Court, which is the Council of Europe now, for example, if remunerated for this activity. So this is, again, trying to, the new proposal for a new law is called Improving Control over the Activities of Foreign Agents. So imagine the lawyers who are preparing cases to be submitted to either the European Court, or although now the European Court continues to view cases from Russia, but of course the Russian Federation is not honoring the decisions of the court, and there are certain, since Russia left the Council of Europe, of course the European Court cannot take up new cases. But imagine the lawyers that are working on cases that are already submitted previously to the European Court, or imagine the lawyers that are submitting information, or human rights defenders, to the ICC on Ukrainian cases, the Ukrainian detainees. They, if remunerated, which could even mean legal fees or transportation of these lawyers, right? They are liable under the new proposal for a law. And another draft law suggests up to 5 years imprisonment and confiscation of property for discrediting the Russian armed forces or calling for sanctions against Russia if remunerated for this activity.
Thank you so much, Vera. Thank you. I would now like to turn to someone who was among this unprecedented international exchange, Ksenia Fadeeva, a former political prisoner and one of the youngest opposition figures to be jailed in Russia. As a young woman who fearlessly stepped into politics, she became a symbol of defiance and hope for a new generation. She was democratically elected city councilor in Tomsk and led Alexei Navalny's regional office in Western Siberia until she was sentenced to 9 years in prison for extremist charges. Her case exemplifies how the Russian regime criminalizes peaceful political participation. Ksenia, you made the conscious decision to stay in Russia, knowing imprisonment was almost inevitable. You called it a matter of principle. Looking back now, what gave you the strength to make that choice?
Большое спасибо. Спасибо. Мое решение оставаться в России было продиктовано тем, что я люблю свой город, Томск и свою страну. Я просто не смогла себя заставить уехать из родных мест, в которых прошла
concept of patriotism in Russia in recent years has unfortunately been distorted. Some now consider patriotism to mean loyalty to those in power. However, in my view, I and the millions of my fellow citizens who have stood up and continue to stand up in the face of repression against the Putin regime, we are the true patriots. Now, today in Russia, more than 2,000 people are being held in prisons, pretrial detention centers, and penal colonies for political reasons. My fellow citizens stood up against the current political regime in Russia over the long years in which Putin has been in power. While a decade ago, we could have counted the number of all political prisoners on the fingers of both hands, and arresting and detaining someone for political grounds would have been front page news. Today, unfortunately, we do not even know the exact number of prisoners of conscience. We don't even know their names. And even regular people, not just political activists, fall into the gristmill of the system. Ordinary citizens do as well. Students, doctors, scientists, entrepreneurs, retirees, and school children. So today I'd like to draw your attention to this. Even under a brutal dictatorship and a dramatic increase in repression which has taken place since the 24th of February of 2022, the citizens of my country continue to stand up against Vladimir Putin and against the war in Ukraine. Hundreds of thousands of Russians were forced to leave the country to avoid being put behind bars or being drafted to serve in a criminal war. Thousands have paid with their freedom, and 20 political prisoners died in the last years. These included Alexei Navalny, Alexander Demidyenko, Igor Pakusin, Kirill Buzmakov, Pavel Kushnir, Dmitry Shvedgauer, Vladimir Kazantsev, Roman Shvedov, and Alexander Pirov. As I make this speech to you today, hundreds of political prisoners are not only incarcerated for political reasons, but they are also undergoing torture. Correctional facilities administrators, in order to demean human dignity and to crush the will of prisoners, put them into so-called punitive detention or punishment cells. Now imagine a room that is 4 meters by 4 meters with a crude wooden cot which folds up against the wall so that you can't even lie down during the day. There's quite simply a table, a narrow bench, and a totally open toilet. It's cold there, there's no hot water, and there are often rats and insects. In a pretrial detention center, visits and packages are forbidden. You cannot access your personal belongings. Officially, a detainee can only spend 15 days in such a place, but in practice, the administrators can simply use false pretenses to continually send the convicted person into an isolation unit. It is impossible to remain healthy under such conditions. Now, another form of torture is certainly the absence of medical attention or assistance. As someone with a brief experience as a prisoner, 9 months, I can tell you that getting medical treatment while in a Russian detention center or penal colony is impossible. In the best case, they'll give you a painkiller. Prisoners, of course, who have chronic illnesses and elderly political prisoners are literally right now in mortal danger. Many of them, unfortunately, simply do not survive until the end of their sentence. There are also thousands of Ukrainian citizens in Russian prisons. They are not prisoners of war. They are held in horrendous conditions and are tortured. Lawyers cannot visit them. Letters from their families never reach them. Last year, a number of such Ukrainians, in fact, died in Russian prisons, including the journalist Victoria Roshina, and their conditions are often worse than the conditions of Russian prisoners. At the end of 2023, I was sentenced to a prison camp for my work as head of the Navalny office in my city and because I was a local elected official in my hometown. I was supposed to be freed in 2032, and I stand before you today thanks to the exchange that took place between Russia and Western countries on the 1st of August 2024. Unfortunately and obviously, it would be impossible to exchange all of the Russian political prisoners today. Western prisons simply do not contain such a high number of the Russian spies and intelligence agents that Vladimir Putin requires. However, in recent months, there is more talk of a possible ceasefire and truce in the war between Russia and Ukraine. All wars end in peace, even a war that the Russian leadership unleashed on a neighboring country. Most likely, following a peace agreement, there will be an exchange of POWs in the all-for-all format as required by the Geneva Convention. It's very important that in the agreement, not only soldiers but also Ukrainian citizens be freed who were kidnapped and held in conditions of torture, and of course that Russian political prisoners be freed. Hundreds of my fellow citizens have paid with the price of their freedom for speaking out against the war. Now, there are lives that are in danger right now. I appeal to the government representatives who are now listening to me. I call upon you to do everything possible so that when a truce is concluded and when sanctions pressure on Russia is lifted, it's already being discussed. Do not forget the Russians who lost their freedom and became political prisoners. I call upon you to do everything in your power to free these brave people. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ksenia. I would like to now turn to Natalia Hershe, a Swiss Belarusian activist. In 2020, during the mass protests against Lukashenko's fraudulent election, she was arrested in Minsk for pulling down a balaclava from a riot officer's face, an act that led to 2.5-year prison sentence. She spent 17 months behind bars in harsh conditions before Swiss diplomatic efforts secured her release. Today, she continues to advocate for those still imprisoned in Belarus. Natalia, your case is an example of how authoritarian regimes use imprisonment to break civil resistance. What does targeted repression in Belarus look like from the inside? What are the conditions like, and how do they affect the mental and physical well-being of prisoners of conscience?
Еще находясь в местах лишения свободы.
Нужно выключить ваш. Сейчас включу. Сейчас можно.
Еще находясь в местах лишения свободы, я дала себе обещание обо всем, что я пережила сказать. Это мой долг перед теми, кто находится там до сих пор. 17 месяцев неволи я побывала в 4 различных местах заключения, но самым ужасным оказалось женская исправительная колония в Когда мы туда прибыли, нас подвергли обыску, отобрали все теплые вещи, выдали 4 униформы и отправили в карантинное отделение, где мы провели 2 недели. Каждые 2 часа при любой погоде мы должны были выходить на перекличку. Выданная мне обувь была постелена. На улице стоял мороз, а длительность проверок составляла 30-40 минут. Весь распорядок дня был намеренно выстроен так, чтобы его также воспроизвели. Очень скоро у меня
Very soon, my knees began to hurt, and I was told that I could only access medical treatment following my quarantine. At that point, the pain was so bad that I couldn't stand up on my own 2 feet without propping myself up with my 2 hands. While still in pre-trial detention, when the Court of Appeals left my sentence unchanged, I wrote a statement saying that I refused to sew uniforms for the regime. In prison colonies, many tried to talk me out of this, but I wouldn't change my mind. So I was assigned to a brigade, a team that took orders. In the workshop, they began to do construction. The walls were covered with oil paint. The odor was unbearable, and one of the women sitting at a sewing machine suddenly fainted. They took her outside briefly to get some air, but soon, as she sat down at her work again, she fainted. An infirmary, an ambulance, a hospital, none of this was available to us for 2 weeks. When I saw her, she was walking with a cane. She'd had a cerebral hemorrhage and she was disabled. One morning, I saw pieces of a uniform on my table. I wrote an official letter refusing to do the work. I knew that this meant that I would be punished with confinement. I was, in fact, given 8 days, to which they then added 10 more days. Despite my complaints about my continued knee pain, the doctors pronounced me ready for this punishment. In detention, they take all your clothes away from you and give you a robe. On the back of the robe, in big letters, is written detention. There's no toilet paper, no toothpaste, no brushes, no soap, no kitchen towels, nothing. There's not even a glass to drink water from. It's cold in the cell, there aren't any sheets, and it's very difficult to sleep in the cold. In order to warm myself up, I tried to run in place, but I couldn't even feel my feet because of the cold. In the end, from being stricken, I ended up with bone fractures, and it was painful for me to walk. On the 5th day, I fell, I fainted, and I hit my head. They quite simply put a bandage on it and put me back into detention, into the cell. On the 9th day, I felt pain that made it difficult. It is difficult for me now to describe to you. It was a very strong, absolutely insupportable pain in my knees. They shook for a few minutes, and then the intensity of the pain was so much that I just couldn't take it anymore. I called for a doctor, but I heard only after your detention. There were 9 days left. At that point, I was truly afraid. I was afraid that I would end up being disabled forever. When my detention period concluded, I was returned to the group. However, no one was ready to provide me with any medical care. I simply had to work. Once again, I found these uniform pieces on my table. Once again, I refused to do this work, and once again, I was given 10 days of detention. I was walking on the balls of my feet. The pain that I felt in my knees was absolutely unbearable. It was clear to me that this could last forever. I decided that I needed to take matters into my own hands. At the factory, I joined together with a group of women who were working with the doctor. I understood that it would be possible for me to, because of my high temperature, go to the hospital, and this was what saved me. I spent a total of 46 days in pretrial detention, and then I was taken to the Mogilev prison. In some way, you could say that this was a relief to me, but there as well, I had health problems, and for 5 weeks I did not receive any medical care. In the cell, it was freezing, and I constantly wore my coat and hat. For some days, the radio was put at full blast. The food was disgusting. I lost 6 kilos of muscle mass. Had it not been released, the health issues could have become irreversible. Right now, it pains me to think that many political prisoners may simply not survive until their release. You see, 7 political prisoners have already died in the prisons of Belarus. The best and the brightest Belarusian politicians are now in prison. They will always be a symbol of the courage and resistance of the Belarusian people, and not only. For each day that they have spent in prison, they are paying with their lives. The democratic community must make every effort to free them. So if you today ask me how to do so, I have one simple response. Sanctions, sanctions, and more sanctions. Economic sanctions, individual sanctions, and not only individual sanctions on people close to the dictator, but also on their close relatives, on their husbands, their wives, and their children. With very clear wording, sanctioned for the fact of political imprisonment in the country. Thank you.
Few people embody the fight for justice like Karina Moskalenko, a pioneering human rights lawyer whose work spans borders and decades. Born in Baku, Azerbaijan, she became the first lawyer to win a case against Russia in the European Court of Human Rights, setting a precedent for countless political prisoners seeking justice. For years, she has defended those persecuted by authoritarian regimes, and since 2021, she has been deeply engaged in investigating human rights violations in Belarus. Now, as chair of the UN Group of Independent Experts on Belarus, she continues her relentless fight to expose abuses and hold perpetrators accountable. Karina, we just heard from Natalia about the toll of Belarusian prisons on those jailed for their convictions. Your latest report confirms that political prisoners face not only harsh conditions, but also forced confessions and systemic mistreatment, part of a deliberate state policy of repression. Given your years of investigating rights violations in Belarus and your broader experience in international law, what realistic path exists to secure justice for these prisoners? And how can the international community ensure their cases are not forgotten?
Thank you, Maria. It works? Yeah. I will try to be short enough, because today we have a privilege and rare opportunity to listen to such people as Natalia, others. And these people, when we say we have 1,200 more political prisoners in Belarus, it's just not true, because we know there are much many. These figures are not clear until now, but since last year, in 2024, the Human Rights Council created a new mechanism, and this new mechanism is doing now really remarkable work on their identifying those survivors, those victims, those perpetrators, and concerning perpetrators, we are doing all possible things to bring perpetrators to be accountable. And this accountability mechanism, which we are proud to conduct together with my friend, Dr. Susan Basile, who is today with us, Professor Monica Latek. We were learning a lot of information. Now we have a huge database, and I'm personally happy to participate in that work. And if you had already chance to see our last report, we just presented it 2 days ago before the Human Rights Council, you will see really new conclusions of our long work, because before this year, last year, we were working on the examination of human rights violations. And you know, probably the most important conclusion of our group, that some of the human rights violations amount to crimes against humanity. This year we made this founding crimes against humanity of persecution and imprisonment. This is exactly what we are today here, political prisoners. One can say that you cannot find strict and accurate definition of political prisoners or prisoners of conscience. But if you look at the definition of imprisonment in Roma Statute and jurisprudence, world jurisprudence, if you look at the definition of prosecution on political grounds, we all have this in our report, and I call you to look at that. And I'm happy to say that when we met Belarusian and international human rights organizations, they said, we are using your findings, we are using your definitions in order to fight against arbitrariness and violations of crimes against humanity in practice. What all was doing Belarusian authorities? This time I had the chance to answer them in Russian. They always refer that the independent country and as Belarus have all the possibility to do all things internal. They forget about the universal standards of human rights and the responsibility of the countries on the international obligation. They forgot that we proposed them a dialogue, a possibility to work together with the mandate. They refused. They had a chance to discuss everything with us. They never replied even to our request on deaths in detention, which is the obligation of the state to investigate and to be able to reply why these deaths happen. This is the concept of positive obligations of the state on right to life. They ignore everything. And when we have today, and why I found it so important to participate in this event, when you see the common pattern of these violations and crimes in Belarus, in Russia, in Azerbaijan, thank you for doing this common event. I feel that not only these three countries still suffer from heritage from the Soviet Union. And if we join our efforts, if we doing our work properly, one day this world would know about crimes and all perpetrators would be brought to responsibility and accountability. This is what I find the most important task of all our efforts. And I am ready to answer your questions, but I would like to see more survivors than we are here today to listen to them and to remember their destinies. Thank you. Now we have a huge database, and I'm personally happy to participate in that work. And if you had already chance to see our last report, we just presented it 2 days ago before the Human Rights Council, you will see really new conclusions of our long work. Because before this last year, we were working on the examination of human rights violations. And you know, probably the most important conclusion of our group, that some of human rights violations amount to crimes against humanity. This year we made this founding crimes against humanity of persecution and imprisonment. This is exactly what we are today here, political prisoners. One can say that you cannot find strict and accurate definition of political prisoners or prisoners of conscience. If you look at the definition of imprisonment in Roma statute and jurisprudence, world jurisprudence, if you look at the definition of prosecution on political grounds. We all have this in our report, and I call you to look at that. And I'm happy to say that when we met Belarusian and international human rights organizations, they said, we are using your findings, we are using your definitions in order to fight against arbitrariness and violations of crimes against humanity in practice. What all was doing Belarusian authorities? This time I had the chance to answer them in Russian. They are always referred that the independent country and as Belarus have all the possibility to do all things internally. They forget about the universal standards of human rights and the responsibility of the countries on their international obligation. They forgot that we proposed them a dialogue, a possibility to work together with the mandate. They refused. They had a chance to discuss everything with us. They never replied even to our request on deaths in detention, which is the obligation of the state to investigate and to be able to reply why these deaths happen. This is a concept of positive obligations of the state on right to life. They ignore everything. And when we have today, and why I found it so important to participate in this event, when you see the common pattern of these violations, crimes, in Belarus, in Russia, in Azerbaijan, thank you for doing this common event. I feel that not only these three countries still suffer from inherited from the Soviet Union, and if we join our efforts, if we doing our work properly, one day this world would know about crimes and all perpetrators would be brought to responsibility and accountability. This is what I find the most important task of all our efforts. And I'm ready to answer your questions, but I would like to see more survivors than we are here today to listen to them and to remember their destinies. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Karina. Thank you for all your work. Our next speaker, Lilia Chanisheva, is a woman of remarkable courage and conviction. A former regional leader of Alexei Navalny's movement, she exposed corruption, mobilized civic activism, and defended environmental causes. Arrested after Navalny's network was declared extremist, she was sentenced to first 7.5 years and later increased to 9.5 years for peaceful political work. You have seen firsthand what political imprisonment looks like in Russia. Beyond the sentences, prison conditions, especially for women, are a punishment in themselves. What can you tell us about life behind bars? How does the treatment of political prisoners compare to others? And what does it reveal about repression in Russia today?
Dear colleagues, I appreciate the opportunity to address you today. I speak to you not only as a politician, but as someone who has lived through repression and 3 years of imprisonment. Today, I'm here to speak about the women who need to be saved right now. Under Putin, the number of political prisoners have grown from 1 to at least 1,500. Today, 1 in 3 is a woman. They are torn from their families, deprived of motherhood, and driven to exhaustion. Just 3 examples. Lyudmila Razumova, 58 years sentenced to 7 years for anti-war graffiti. For every complaint she files in colony, she is sent to a punishment cell. Official reason? Storing buns in a freezer or failing to label lemons. Ordinary criminals are punished for fighting or drinking of alcohol. Political prisoners for speaking up. Lyudmila is imprisoned in colony number 5 in the Tver region under Anna Smirnova. Next one. Maria Ponomarenko, 46 years old, a journalist. She was sentenced to 6 years for telling the truth about the war. She has endured torture, forced psychiatric treatment, and isolation. Recently, prison authorities drove her to a suicide attempt. Luckily, she survived, and now she faces a new charge for assault because she stepped barefoot on a guard's foot as they dragged her to a disciplinary commission. Now, political prisoners face new charges before finishing their first sentence. And the person responsible for Maria's second prosecution is Anton Litvinenko, the chief officer of colony number 6 in the Altai region. And last, Zareva Musaeva, 55 years old, mother of a Chechen opposition activist. She suffers from diabetes and needs a cane to walk. She was sentenced to 4 years and 9 months because her son criticized Ramzan Kadyrov, the leader of Chechnya region. After his latest statements about Kadyrov, she now faces 5 more years, also for assault, which could be a death sentence for her. This is happening in colony number 5 in Chechnya under Hussein Dukliev. Lyudmila and Maria are imprisoned for their courage and truth, just like Alexei Navalny, who was killed in prison. Zarema is a hostage, just as Navalny's brother once was. I urge the international community to include all women political prisoners in peace negotiations. I come from Bashkortostan, and I cannot stay silent about the Baimak case. A year ago, thousands of people peacefully gathered in Baimak to support Fail Alsynov, an activist defending indigenous lands. Riot police crushed the protest. Over 80 were arrested. 2 died from torture, and 30 received prison sentence from 3.3 to 8.5 years, while the rest await their verdicts. The authorities prosecute these people in regions far from their homes and prohibit from writing letters in their native language. Their family, including 165 children, are demanding amnesty, and I am their voice. I call on the international community to support this demand. And one last question to Russian friends at the United Nations. You ask UN Special Reporter Marianna Katsarova how she gets information about repression in Russia. But if she has not been allowed into the country. But why don't Russian authorities invite her? If Russia has signed international human rights treaty and truly cares about its citizens, what are they afraid of? President Trump asked Putin this question, and if he refuses to invite Marianna Katsarova, invite her yourself. Let the world hear her. And finally, my message to Putin. Release all political prisoners and Ukrainian citizens. Grant amnesty to all participants of the Baimak case. Thank you for attention.
Thank you so much, Lydia. Thank you. And I will skip my question and I will go straight to Emin. I will just introduce. Emin is a journalist and human rights defender from Azerbaijan. In 2014, facing persecution, he spent nearly a year hidden inside the Swiss embassy in Baku before escaping with the help of Swiss diplomacy. Please, Emin.
Thank you. We're really sorry for miscalculate our time. I think we have to finish soon, but I will try to finish in 1 minute. I'm from Azerbaijan, and I would like to speak on behalf of Azerbaijan political prisoners. Most of my colleagues right now detained and jailed on different political related charges, and numbers of political prisoners this person arrested just day before he must leave to US, and received this US State Department Human Rights Award, and now he's under strong, extreme, serious pressure in Azerbaijan prison. I would like to ask again, US, even with new administration, to push the Azerbaijan government and bring our colleagues out and never compromise with such kind of bloody regimes as Ali. Again, thanks for everyone, thanks for the future of Russia, thanks for Madame Repression to having time and join to our event. And it's a great honor for us to host this event and to pick up on behalf of the voiceless people who is jailed in Belarus, Russia, and Azerbaijan. Thank you all. And again, thanks for Secretariat for understanding, and we are really sorry, apologize for taking a lot of time. Our guests are here. We don't have any more time for Q&A, I think.
I will make an announcement.
Yeah. So I'm finished.
Can I just make a suggestion? I mean, why don't you maybe we have a list of the political prisoners in Azerbaijan that need to be released as soon as possible because of their poor health or torture, subjected to torture. Maybe I would be happy to transmit or to ask colleagues from governments to receive this list from you, because there is no special rapporteur in Azerbaijan. Yes.
Last colleague, which is participate with us on the side event here on 15th of March 2024. Anar Mamadi, co-founder of Climate for Justice Campaign, because Azerbaijan COP29 chairmanship in last year and this year's presidency. He is arrested right after returning back from Azerbaijan from Geneva. And we thanks for we have finished.
This should be submitted to the Secretary General and the Assistant Secretary General, because every year there is a report that the Secretary General issues on reprisals for participation in the work of the UN or with human rights mechanisms of the UN. So this case needs to be brought to the Secretary General. We will discuss it.